Hey everyone, we're just giving folks a couple of minutes to join us on LinkedIn and on Zoom. So we'll get started in just about another minute. Okay, folks, I'm going to get us started. Welcome everyone. I'm Tim Erlin. I'm the VP of Product at Wallarm, and I'm really excited about this webinar we've got planned today, a CISO's view on building an API security program in 2025. And just a couple of housekeeping items. We are doing this webinar on both Zoom and LinkedIn. So if you have comments or questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them either in the LinkedIn comments or in the Q&A in Zoom, and we'll do our best to pick those up along the way or at the end and respond to them or answer them. The webinar is being recorded, so you can get a copy of the recording. It's also, because it's on LinkedIn, it continues to be sort of persistently available there, so you can always watch it again on LinkedIn if you'd like, or share it from LinkedIn if you'd like to do that as well. Following Wallarm on LinkedIn is a good way to keep abreast of those events that we have and future webinars as well. And so with that, I want to welcome the two guests that we have today. We've got Andrew Becker, who is a virtual CISO and advisor, formerly the CSO at Datadog, and Rick Bohm, who is the CISO at Point Solutions Group. So welcome, Rick. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you both for joining us today.
Good morning.
Thank you.
So part of the purpose of this webinar in particular is to look at what's happened in the last year that impacts API security. So I want to start us off by talking about what changed in 2024. And I put together a couple of slides to sort of prompt the conversation, but we can kind of take it where it goes. There are two reports that Wallarm puts together, research reports that I'll talk about to spur that conversation. The first is our API honeypot report. So this is a report that we put together at the end of last year. We built a distributed API honeypot because we wanted to understand what happens to newly deployed APIs. What does that initial traffic look like? Sort of time to discovery, that kind of thing. And so I'm not going to repeat the whole report here. There's a URL if you want to go look for it. But there were two data points that I wanted to pull out that are things that I thought were relevant to the what changed in 2024 question. The first was the time to discovery. So how quickly, when you deploy a new API, how quickly is that API discovered by someone? How quickly does it see traffic? And the average we saw there was 29 seconds. And the longest time frame we saw was 34, actually. So under a minute, guaranteed you deploy a new API, it's going to be discovered. And then the second piece of data here was some calculation we did around how quickly an attacker can extract data from your API. And we did this in three parts. So at the bottom, we started with kind of a baseline of traditional web scraping, right? The kind of thing that happened in the past where you build a scraper for a web application. And that took the longest, not surprisingly, and extracted the at lower bandwidth usage, but it takes longer. Then we could talk about a single API request, or a series of single requests, if you will. Now we're talking here about 10 million user records, still pretty fast at that point, more bandwidth usage. But the thing that really was surprising was the use of batching. So if you use batched queries with XML RPC or GraphQL, an attacker can really accelerate their ability to steal data from your API. So for us, it looks like 2024, the speed at which your APIs get discovered and the speed at which attackers can steal data is a significant change that impacts your API security program. So I know, Rick and Andrew, you guys haven't looked at this whole report necessarily, unless you did since yesterday. But does this data seem like a change to you, or does this seem like confirmation of something that you already knew? Rick, why don't you start?
Well, yeah, we talked about this last summer. Just to give you a quick background into why I look at things in different ways, is I turncoated. I went from the traditional, defensive based CISO role in enterprise, Fortune 500 companies, into a CISO role where I lead and operate with red team and a lot of penetration testing. And this was one of the scariest things that came to mind. I've happened to work with a couple of people that just are absolutely amazing when it comes to being able to replicate this type of activity. And it was one of the first things that gave me that oh shit moment of, wow, this fast, I can steal something. This fast, not only can I steal that, we know a lot of bad development practices mean that it's probably replicated somewhere else as well, which means what else can I steal? So the people that I work with now, since I've moved more into the offensive security, have shown me ways and techniques, and have obviously explored different techniques away to be able to see these same things. And it really was eye-opening. Like I said, it's something you don't want to see as a defensive CISO in a big corporation but it's something that I saw that validation in 2024, and I'm still seeing that existing in coming into 2025. And there's other aspects we'll talk about later into 2025. But yeah, absolutely. I've seen this. I've seen being able to extract a large sum of data very quickly, especially we talk about the batching process and batched API calls, and being able to run multiple requests or single requests. With multiple operations in a single request, or single multiple operations going on. I've been able to see that and be able to experience it, and I can confirm it is a scary thing to see, but also it's there's definitely some opportunity for improvement for us on the defensive side as we go forward into 2025.
Hmm. Hmm. And
Yeah,
yeah, go
I
ahead,
think
Andrew. Yeah.
I think I just echo what Rick said. And in that, like, this is very confirming for me. Tim, yesterday you and I were talking about some ancient history and information security, the old at stake research, out of that Loft Heavy Industries team and whatnot, about Windows exploitation, and back around 2000, how long would an unpatched Windows box last on the public internet? And so it seems like, we in this industry have to sort of illuminate how fast attackers actually work, because I don't think human psychology is very amenable to understanding the scale of the internet, right? And the tools that attackers are able to leverage in order to exploit systems at scale, and therefore how quickly things can go sideways, and that obscurity is really no defense in the face of the amount of activity we see on the internet.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think you're right about that sort of inability to conceptually understand the scale involved. There are people who understand it at points in time, but it is incredibly difficult to keep that, in your mind, as you go about your day-to-day business, either as a developer or a security practitioner, or certainly, the average executive,
Yeah,
just
humans
doesn't
are
doesn't
just
think of it.
really bad with large numbers, right? We just don't deal well with like exponents. Like, it's
Th-
just not, because
This is
there's
why
nothing in our
IPv6
lived
has never
experience.
taken off, right? That's why IPv6 doesn't work. Human beings are bad with large numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So I don't know. I honestly don't know if this time to discovery piece is something that changed in 2024, or if it's just confirmation of something that already existed. But the confirmation, I think, having the information exist is valuable for thinking about what you actually have to do for an API security program in 2025. And the speed at which the data can be extracted, to me, that really is sort of a light bulb moment. Because if you think about what you have to build in terms of defenses, you have to stop that attack, in real time in order to prevent the data from being stolen. You don't have minutes, let alone hours, to do an investigation and respond, because the data is already gone at that point.
That's a fair point. And Tim, one thing, in working with a lot of especially large enterprises, their SLAs are measured in oftentimes hours. And here we're talking seconds. And we start talking about this confirmation of 29 seconds. I have to be honest, I've worked for some very big publicly traded companies, and none of them are equipped to be able to respond in that kind of time. And it's unfortunate, but it's a reality that we have to deal with when we start talking about defensive security. It's just, I mean, that's a minuscule amount of time to be able to extract a large amount of data. And again, what else is in that API? We're talking about, key reuse, token reuse, authentication reuse that goes on everywhere because of, again, really corner cutting in the SDLC for the whole, application system. And sometimes I've seen some of the guys that I work with who've extracted APIs, extracted keys or tokens out of APIs and found their reuse across many other ecosystems within the same company, both inside and outside of the company, AWS interfaces, SendMail interfaces. Suddenly you have some pretty big keys to the kingdom. And again, as we talked about last year, when we couple that with poor API documentation and definitions internally, poor inventory of APIs, that's data's one thing. How much of a persistent foothold do you think after that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look at a different bit of data here. So this is data that's not exclusive to WallArm, but is part of our API threat stats report that we will release at the end of the month. One of the pieces of information in that report is just tracking how many of the vulnerabilities in CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list are related to APIs, right? And what we saw in last year's report, so data for 2023 reported in 2024, was that about 20% of those CISA KEV vulnerabilities, not to be redundant, were related to APIs. And that number through 2024, now going into the 2025 report, is 50%, so an increase of 30%. So what we're seeing as a change in 2024 is just a massive increase of the number of API-related vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited, because that's what this list is, right? It's known exploited vulnerabilities. And I think, that's worth noting as you go into 2025 to look at your API security program, is that you have more exploits happening in the environment for sure. Yeah. So I don't know that that's going to surprise anybody. I don't know, Andrew or Rick, are either of you surprised by that?
Well, I mean, it's just confirmation of the old adage, right? Like, why rob banks? It's where the money is, right? Like attackers are going to go where opportunity exists to meet their goals, right? To steal data, to steal services, to disrupt operations, whatever their particular objectives are. And in 2024, 2025, APIs provide a phenomenal amount of leverage for attackers.
Well, so let's drill into that for a little bit, because I think we're almost saying something and not quite saying it, which is an answer to the question of why has there been an increase in the number of API related vulnerabilities? It's related to the increase in the number of APIs that are deployed, right? And that's being driven by what? What's driving the increase in the number of APIs that organizations are deploying in general?
I think the biggest thing is data integration. A lot of companies, not only internally are they integrating multiple systems. In fact, I had a really good conversation with somebody I think is on this call now, but we had this conversation yesterday about when you start incorporating the microservices that the APIs that are used to communicate just between microservices. We're using APIs more so than ever. We're doing a lot of data exchanges between companies. And I think when you see companies growing with that data exchange, and suddenly it's easy to replicate company A, then company B, then company C, just being able to integrate into your surface, it becomes a wider attack surface. And again, when you incorporate that with poor inventory, poor practices, replication of API keys and tokens, suddenly you've now, your threat landscape is just growing exponentially, just like your APIs are. And I think APIs grew exponentially over 2024 and continue to in 2025, which is why we're starting to see this trend. And I'm interested to see when they say API related, because again, from a penetration testing perspective, when we extract an API key and then we attack another area. That's oftentimes looked at as two separate attacks. When we're saying, hold on a second, we got your data, or we extracted your API data, or we extracted information about the system that was used in that attack, where do you start directly or indirectly calling those things together? So I'm not surprised by the numbers. I'm actually expecting to see those numbers go up from my perspective, just from what we see from that attack surface.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah.
Tim, to come back to your original sort of why, and Rick said data integration, but I think, Mark Andreessen's thesis that software is eating the world, I think rings true for me here, right? In that, I had the good fortune to start working with Amazon Web Services, basically like EC2's release to market, and got to experience kind of the inside baseball of both the internal APIs and the external APIs as they grew that cloud business, right? And then I had the good fortune to join Datadog in 2015 and sort of watch the adoption of DevOps and, and how every company, it always amazed me who Datadog's biggest customers were, right? Because every company was a software company, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you see, right? If you ask why, why are there so many more APIs? It's because every company is a software company now, and APIs are, how we do software in 2025.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I can't help but think that the adoption of generative AI has driven some of that too. It's hard to know exactly how impactful that is. Um, it certainly appears impactful from the amount of conversation about it, but all those generative AI integrations are API based, right? And so there's going to be some API driven growth there for sure.
Yeah, there's
Absolutely.
lots to talk about agents, right? OpenAI is going to release an agent this year and whatnot. And obviously agents, can drive interfaces. We've seen the folks at Rabbit try to do that with their action model or whatever. Although I think they've had difficulty with it. And so I think, for agents to sort of fulfill the promise of the semantic web, right? To show how old I
Oh God, semantic web.
am.
There's a book of semantic web book on my bookshelf right over there.
But APIs are going to be necessary for
Yeah,
if autonomous agents are to reach what we're expecting in terms of or what the hype is forecasting. Although
yeah.
I would probably argue against you, Tim, in terms of that actually affecting any of the numbers we've collected
Mm.
through 2024.
Yeah, yeah. You think it's hype, not reality in terms of
No,
API.
I mean, people are using generative AI a lot, and the earliest adopters tend to be in the software development organization, so the coding assistants and whatnot, GitHub and that sort of
Yeah,
thing. And then we are seeing it also in the customer service and in those sort of chatbots and whatnot, with much hilarity in some cases. I think we've discussed the car dealership customer service bots that have been abused and whatnot.
yeah,
But I think, we're still very early in the life cycle of those technologies in terms of what we're actually going to see in terms of deployment and implementation.
yeah. Interesting, interesting. So the slide I've put up here is from our API threat stats report. It's our dynamic top 10. So similar in a little way to the OWASP API top 10, but built from the data that we have and updated a little more frequently. So it shows the changes from the 2024 rankings that we had to the 2025 rankings, and the lines between them to see how they changed on a quarter by quarter basis. I pulled out sort of the top movers. The broken access is probably the big gainer in terms of category, moving from spot 5 up to spot 2. And then the other two, authentication flaws and cross-site issues, have dropped a little bit to accommodate that move up from broken access. Otherwise, most of these stayed the same. We did end up adding a new category this year for memory corruption and overflows in APIs. So that's sort of appears at the bottom in Q1 and ultimately ends up in spot number 9. And there'll be a bunch of detail in the report about why we added that. But it just goes to show that while there certainly are some things that changed in 2024, I almost want to call out on this chart the things that haven't changed. Injections as a category remains at the top. So the number one type of attack we see are really the injections. And so addressing the basics, ejections, broken access control, authentication flaws, these are not new things in the space. They continue to be the problems that at least we see in our research. at the top of the list in terms of what you need to defend against. And Rick, does that match up with what you see as well in the in your space?
Yeah, it does. My only surprise, I think, out of this whole graph is the cross-site issues. We still see a lot of cross-site issues, maybe, but it hasn't really moved that
Yeah.
much. It's still
No,
there, but no, the
still
broken
number 5.
access,
Yeah.
the broken access is definitely something we see.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I won't dive into that too much, but I thought it's always interesting to see what the trends look like, and if there have any major changes. But the basics are still very important. That's what it comes down to. So
Yeah.
I always, we can talk a lot about data, and sort of the aggregate and summary of the data, but I always think it's useful to fill in that data with some specific incidents that occurred. And there were plenty of API security incidents that happened in 2024. So I picked 3 to include here out of the myriad, and they're kind of labeled with the overall root cause in this incident. But we'll start with Optus here. So Optus labeled as a broken access control issue, but the interesting thing about this is that it was sort of a 2-step attack. The first was that there was this broken access control issue on their web application, and that was addressed, but it was not addressed on the corresponding API, and that left them open to attack. Ultimately affected 10 million customers, and there was a regulatory action court filing. Optus is in Australia in Q2 of 2024. So an interesting incident that shows that the API behind the web application is important as well. So I don't know if there's anything you guys wanted to add to that, or interesting things about that incident that you remember.
Well, I just point out, I'm sort of old enough to remember when your web application and your API were very separate and distinct, right? And that the technologies, didn't really cross over that much.
Yeah.
And, today, that's just not the case, right? They just intermingle to a degree that, test coverage and testing coverage becomes really, really important to understand in terms of your assessment and validation and your vulnerability management capabilities.
And in I think in many cases, if not most cases at this point, if you can effectively secure that API, if that's what the web application is using, then you've effectively secured the web application. And to your point, in the past, Andrew, those things might have different paths to data. And today, it's not always, certainly, but often a single path through that API.
Yeah, I think it gets weird when you start talking in like front end specific attacks. So I think
yes,
the correct nerd in our audience might be leaving comments for you right now.
That's fair. That's fair.
But yes, I'd say the greater part of the battle is in securing those paths to the data. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I've learned anything in cybersecurity, it's that you pretty much have to caveat everything.
Tim,
yeah, go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
One thing I wanted to add on there, that I think when you start thinking of how did we get here? Why do these things happen? Of all the groups I work with or have worked with in the past, I can honestly tell you there's only one customer I have right now that when I went to start doing their pen test, they were like, here's our API inventory, here's our documentation, here's our API definitions. And they were the same group that I was having a conversation with yesterday about the inclusion of so many APIs internally on their own microsystems or microservices. Where do we draw the line? Where do we want to test, and where do we want to start protecting internally versus externally? That's the bigger problem. Most people, it's very similar to 2024 in the conversation we had, was when we go on site, it's like, okay, what's in scope? And they want to do a penetration test. Okay, your API is in scope. Yes, cool. Do you have any specific APIs you want us to test? And they just look at you in that blank deer in the headlights, and you're like, okay, so if you don't have the inventory, you can't even have that conversation of how are we protecting our app? How are we protecting the perimeter from an application perspective? And as Andrew brought up, I also am of the age where those two things were separate. They're not anymore. But you still have to think about, if there's an app to protect, there probably is an adjacent API that's going to go in there. We also need to protect. And when you don't, people like me or people like the guys that I work with grab those tokens, grab that auth mechanism or bypass that auth mechanism. And then we found our way into the app as well. So I think the bigger conversation is in 2025 is how do we start thinking about all of the app, all of the attack surface together versus just the web interface. And we leave the APIs just to deal with themselves.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, Rick, about how do you communicate to the people that are doing testing, like what's in scope and whatnot. And I think something that we forget in some methods of testing, particularly in bug bounties, is what you can reasonably expect to get out of certain testing methodologies like bug bounties. And the thing is, with bug bounties, you might not get that depth of coverage in your APIs because frequently the type of tester persona who's executing the test is going to hit that web layer much more heavily than they'll necessarily dive into APIs or goodness help you if you have like a thick client or something, right? You just can't expect a testing methodology like a bug bounty program to actually exercise, those more obscure paths. And so it's sort of understanding like how, an in-house testing team versus, a penetration testing and application security testing partner versus a bug bounty program or other testing services, how those can actually fit in to give you that insight into the security posture of your application overall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And having that ownership and accountability at the development level or design level, as well as the maintenance. Right now, it seems that it's still kind of a lost entity that, we threw an API out there and you forget about it. Or a developer says, hey, that API works, let's duplicate it and use it for something else. And next thing you know, you've replicated a bad situation.
Yeah. Interesting. The conversation about scope, it feels connected to the second incident that I have up here, actually. This incident with Dell, the reason I picked it's an API abuse incident, is in part because it has a non-technical component to it, right? So the deal here is that the attacker signed up as a partner through this partner portal that existed, and that there was no validation of that account. So they're not a real partner, but nobody validated that. And then using that legitimate partner account they created, they were able to then essentially run something like 5,000 requests per minute over a period of 3 weeks to scrape user data, 49 million users. And so the technical issue there is, something around API abuse and rate limiting and scraping, and can you detect that type of API abuse? But the non-technical issue is, are you validating these accounts? Is it an account takeover attack if they signed up as a legitimate partner and nobody validated it, right? Which, to your point, Rick, is what's in scope, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
interesting.
Well, it speaks to the elephant that's not on your list, which is Salt Typhoon, right? I understand why Salt Typhoon might not make a list like this because it's very complicated. It's multiple incidents, right?
Yes.
But it, frequently honed in on law enforcement access, right? It's a very dangerous capability. It's important, it's essential in the United States for a telecom to provide law enforcement access. But, it then speaks to like how can you defend, these capabilities, right? So in this case, Dell had a partner portal, and they missed some steps there in terms of like how to validate who gets access to it, right? In the case of Salt Typhoon, it's sort of different based on which telecom we're talking about and whatnot. But it is that you've got this, this radioactive capability, and what is, what will it turn out to be sufficient in order to defend that that necessary functionality.
Yeah. Interesting. So the last incident I included here was this Twilio Authy incident. Partly because broken authentication was one of the categories that moved up, but also because of that speed of data theft, right? In fact, Twilio did a pretty good job of responding to this incident when it occurred. They responded fairly quickly, but the data's already gone, right? Those 33 million phone numbers that attacker was accessing already been taken. And so it's an example of that sort of speed of data theft that we were talking about on the honeypot report slide as well. So
Yeah.
yeah. So before I move on to the key elements for that your API security program in 2025, are there any changes in 2024 that I missed that you two think were relevant or are relevant moving forward?
I don't think anything you missed.
I think Rick, you and I were talking a little bit about the regulatory environment before. Is that something that's changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think in 2025, I think 8 states, including, not only states in the United States, but countries in the EU, directives in the EU, and then of course the American Privacy Rights Act. Um, a lot of new things are being enacted from a compliance perspective that bring APIs into scope when it comes to auditing and testing and such. And I think they were never explicitly called out. And it's like, obviously in a compliance audit, you don't call out all the things that could happen. Your goal in that, as a business is to pass those things, and you try to keep your dirty laundry internal. And now those things being exposed and brought to the forefront. I know California, Colorado, Oregon, Montana. There's a couple other states. I'll have to look them up. Virginia has now as one as well. But they're executing data privacy laws that actually are bring APIs into scope. If they exchange data, they are now in scope for those audits for those data regulatory constructs for software, where it used to just be focused on the web app, how you stored the data, how you deleted the data when you were done with it. And they never really exclusively called out APIs. And I know the DORA Act for the EU came in January for 2025. Again, it goes alongside a GDPR. Data is being exchanged. We want to know about it. We want to be able to understand it. We want to have some regulation around it. And it wasn't ever put in place before. So I know it's from a CISO's perspective, it's just one more thing that just got thrown on your desk. But that thing has always been there. It just was never on your desk before. It was on the floor. So I'm kind of personally, I'm happy about it. I'd like to see people, as I said, of all the groups I work with, there's one company that even had an inventory. And so when you start thinking about where your data exists, and I think all of us who've used T-Mobile or AT&T and Verizon are all pissed off because our data is all over the dark web, we know now. We're happy to see these kind of regulations come into play, although it is a little bit in hindsight, like I said, most of our data is out there. But if you're working hard to rebuild your own persona and clean up what's out there in the past, you don't want to see it go out there again. You want to be able to start to protect your data or reprotect your data, protect your social security number, protect your new addresses, and do things like that. So I think it's a good opportunity to bring that into the compliance light, which means we have to start testing for it. We have to start documenting. We have to start proving where these things are, and it means a pain point for CISOs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Tim, I think one thing maybe we should just sort of address as well is how many of us are doing more with less. For some of us, this is situation normal. We've always been a cost center. We've always like made do with as much as we could eke out of our budgets. For some of us, this is like a post zero interest rate phenomena, right? The various waves of layoffs that we've seen in 23 and 24. And then now with, many of us having to deal with, white hot generative AI initiatives and just the speed of business as everything is picking up. So our development organizations, our businesses are moving faster and faster, but we're still dealing, many of us, with the diminished staffing coming out of the last couple of years. So it's a real challenge for many of us to keep up with just the pace of things.
That's an important aspect is budgets and resources, right? I'm always fond of saying that technology it doesn't evolve, it aggregates, right? So you get new things like generative AI, but that doesn't mean that you got rid of the mainframe that you're running your business on. That now you have both, and you didn't get more budget. So from a security standpoint, so that's that's definitely a challenge. Interesting one to talk about as well.
Yeah, some of my biggest celebrations were always when we turned things off.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Decommissioning is a good thing. Yeah,
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 and to that point, Andrew, going back to the very beginning, the 29 seconds, one of the biggest things we do when we start a pen test is obviously OSINT, open source intelligence gathering. And we use, Wayback Time Machine. I mean, there's so many bots and scrapers all that capture that. So to hear that something's out there 29 seconds is I keep coming back to that. I'm like, yeah, it makes sense. But I also realize that I'm a consumer of those 29 seconds. When we're doing our penetration tests, I'm pulling up, Google Dorking, we're going anywhere where we can find information. You put something out there and oh shit, I pulled it back, I took it down. It's out there. It's out there forever. It's in somebody's cache somewhere. It's going to be posted on the dark web. It's going to be sold. It's going to be reused after it's been out there for those 29 seconds. And we try to replicate as much state actor activity as we can and dark web activity as we can when we do our penetration tests. We sit in a lot of those forums and we do see those same things that you're mentioning here. But again, when I put on my prior hat and I think about it from a defensive position, you realize you got a development team that accidentally posted an API out there and a key. It's there. It's out there. It's going to be reused. That means you have to, rinse and wash out everything you've already done, remove that from everywhere. And just like the exposures we just saw, you fix it on the website. Oh, let's get that key out of there. Let's get that token out of there. But you forgot about it in that other spot means guess what? It still exists and it'll exist in perpetuity in cache. So if you don't remove its usage on your platform everywhere it exists, it's gonna be an
it's out
exposure.
there.
And as we
Yeah.
know, nobody's inventorying that.
Yeah, well, so I mean that's a good transition to the sort of the key requirements conversation. I think that the first thing that I put in here as a placeholder was API discovery. And as you were saying, Rick, the lack of visibility into what your API inventory looks like is a common problem. If you're in that position, you're in the majority at this point today.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's definitely a requirement from for your API security program in 2025 is discovery and inventory, is that the starting point? Is that where everybody should start?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I think it's
And
the first step of admitting you have a problem. How big is my problem?
yeah. And so it's easy to say, API discovery, API inventory, but what does that really mean? What's included when you think about someone having that inventory? What's included in the inventory, the API inventory, if they're doing it right or if they're doing it well?
Well, again, I've got one customer that's on this call that not only did they have the full inventory, they've got all the documentation, they've got the life cycle of it, they've got the versions of that inventory. And they're the only ones I've dealt with. And don't get me wrong, their APIs aren't perfect. They've got some things that they've identified ways they can get better, and they follow the attack chains that go on in the world as well. But they have the starting point. They have them all documented. They know the versions, they know the expectation, they know the usage of the API, the expected usage, and what potentially could be exploited with it on what's going to cause them to version this in the future. And they also know then how to retire those APIs effectively, meaning retiring it from existence on the app as well as where it integrates into their microservices. So that's what I like to see that. Now, do they have the most mature inventory? No, they don't. No, they don't. But they have something that works effectively for them. And I think that's where you got to come back to, and you got to say, well, first off is where are all of our APIs and what's our process for deploying a new API? What we don't want to do is do a lot of key reuse. We don't want to use authentication and token reuse. We need to have those processes embedded in at the development level, and they have to be part of that testing process as well. So we have to have that accountability there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
So they're actually, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I was a software developer long before I was a security professional, and I just keep coming back to, security is essentially this sort of like subset of what we see in software development, and particularly I think about observability, right? So I think about our colleagues that are SREs or that are big in observability, and it's just impossible to operate a modern software system if you don't know what it is, right? And what are the various contracts under which it should be operating, and what is what is an anomalous condition, right? And so security is
Mhm.
exactly the same. That if you are not aware of the constituent parts of a software system that you're responsible for, you have no hope of defending it.
Yeah, yeah. So there are a couple questions in the Q&A that I think are relevant to this conversation. So I'm gonna bring them up now as opposed to waiting until the end. Uh, the first one, someone has asked, how important is IT asset management for IT security? Can we have all the API inventory in the IT asset management tool? And I think to your point, Andrew, there's this concept of observability, and there's a concept of security observability, and maybe they're overlapping Venn diagrams, but they're not 100% overlapping. Like there are differences there.
There are differences, although frequently there's sort of like differences that are imposed by commerce, right? By
Mm-hmm.
what buyers of particular like services acquire and who the buyer is. So if you're selling to SREs, you're going to see different things in the interface than if you're selling to a security engineer, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the question that Dinesh asked, and thank you for that, is about IT asset management for IT security. And there, yeah, we get into the like commerce issues because so as a chief information security officer, I've been responsible for IT security, and then I've also been responsible for software security, right? I've been responsible for the public service that we develop and sell, and so managing IT assets like laptops and printers and servers, that's important and essential. Managing APIs and applications and cloud accounts and all those sorts of things, also essential. I've never seen, a place where like those could be held in common.
yeah,
Certainly, I'm sure there's somebody out there that baked their own thing with Elasticsearch. Who's
yeah. Oh,
gonna
there's some
blow me up
vendor
in
out
the
there who's going,
comments.
no, no, we do that, we do that. Yeah, yeah,
But they are, I think, they are these domains that require a certain amount of domain expertise and
yeah.
tool speciality, right? In order to, you're asking Rick as well about like what do you expect in API discovery? And Rick spoke to things about versions and versioning and capabilities and whatnot. And so you're not gonna find a single knowledge store that's going to hold laptops and Windows versions and APIs and API versions and whatnot. And so I think we're sort of stuck with a world where we're going to have a number of tools for doing this sort of overall. We can think of like asset management. Think of the concept writ large as like I need to manage my laptops and I need to manage my APIs, but you're going to have differing staff and differing tools that are going to be working in concert,
Hmm.
for all of the software in your organization, whether it's software you consume or software you produce.
Yeah, yeah. I had a previous colleague who was talked a lot about the dividing tools into these categories of, you know, uh, data collection and sense making. And, the data collection for inventory is going to be very different. You're collecting different data. And then,
Yeah.
you might have, you will have different tools that do that. You could theoretically have a single tool that makes sense of all that data, but to your point, you're going to have different audiences, and the idea that you know the interaction between vendors and customers is going to drive separate tools there is a really interesting one, actually. Yeah. So I mean, I think we agree that API discovery is kind of a key starting point um, for any API security program, right? You're going to want to start with understanding what's in your environment. I know it's a sort of a trite adage of, you can't protect what you don't know about. So that seems reasonable. The second topic that I wanted to cover here was about connecting API security to the business. And I will say to start with that I think in 2024 and before, API security has been primarily a technical topic,
Mhm.
the realm of, you know, maybe the CISO, but more likely AppSec and AppSec practitioners. But we just talked about earlier how the growth in API risk has been driven by the growth in usage of APIs in the business. So does this connection to the business for API security, is that part of the 2025 landscape? And how would you go about doing that from a practitioner standpoint? Rick, you're off mute. I'll put you up
Yeah,
first.
That's an interesting one because I keep going back to the Dell one. There's obviously a disconnect from biz dev
Mm,
and development there in that situation. And you have to remember through all of this, business context is really what drives the API existence to begin with. And we do this because we want to do data exchange between 2 points, or we want to have access to that data from an e-commerce perspective. We want better customer experience. We want our APIs to actually be revenue generators. So I think the real conversation is how do we connect the business to the security team, and having the development team also in that same triangle, so that it is essentially we're developing and we're building what the business wants, but we're doing it securely. Like I see a lot of times where APIs get deployed and security doesn't even know about it. And like, well, the business requested this type of integration. The business wanted us to be able to expose this endpoint for this deal we've done at a contract level. And their risk appetite on the business side is way higher than on the security side. And that tug of war is where we live in hopefully a somewhat secure world. And that tug of war is not always happening. So I think it's about bringing those communication lines together, understanding what the business is trying to achieve, not let the business drive the design of the API as much as I think they've done in the past. And again, bringing that compliance aspect back into it may give the lever that you actually need to be able to have those more effective conversations, because in the past, like it was just done. And in fact, we probably don't even know how many API exposures there actually have been until you start going through forensically and people having to start answering these questions from a compliance side.
Yeah, you're right. Compliance is a traditional tool for establishing, leveraging to build that connection between IT and IT security in the business, because it puts a dollar amount on the risk that is easily calculable usually, if it's done right. Yeah.
We had an anonymous attendee ask a question that I think is relevant here they ask about how about third parties. You talked about Beyond Trust recently and Facebook back in the day. And so there's this idea that we leverage a lot of APIs from third parties, and maybe they have access to our data. Maybe we've given them exports of data, or maybe they have live access to it. And then it's sort of like like how do we work with the business in terms of then integrating the third party and the third party's APIs and what's required of them. My friends in legal, always my best friends in any company I work at, right? We work on contractual terms, which, hopefully sort of specify that partner is going to be a good partner. But then it's sort of like what might one do, in order to validate that they're being a good partner. And I've been subject to, pen tests by my partners, right? My partners actually like pen tested me. That's a thing that happens, right? But that's that whole universe of, when we cross organizational boundaries, and there is risk associated with, because they have live access to data or exported data. How do we incorporate that in our security practice?
Pen tests and security questionnaires, right? That's those are the current most modern tools available for that type of challenge. No, I mean, I think it's a good point. It is a serious concern, and the more that you have, to Rick's point of APIs are there to exchange data, the more you have your data being exchanged between two third parties, the harder it is to technically enforce, your requirements for API security. So I think of things like, integrations between, Jira and Salesforce, right? Where that data is exchanged between two APIs that never traverse your infrastructure, but it's your data ultimately, and that's a real challenge.
Yeah, and to that point, Tim, I think the other thing that takes place historically, and again, I hope this comes more to light, is, as we see a lot of business logic attacks with a lot of machine readable policies, we're starting to see companies start to embrace API security as a service, number one. So I'm starting to see companies actually say, what do you mean we have all those APIs out there? Now what do we do? we're not staffed for this. We didn't even know this existed. Then my question back to them is, well, what kind of insights do you have? You build these, your business, biz dev teams design these plans to integrate with another company. A developer turns that into an API that gets deployed. What type of insights do you have on that? What type of, are you really going back and calculating that risk versus reward? Was your reward as big as expected versus how big was the risk? Is there any API driven insights that are coming back to this? Because that may drive the whole, yeah, we're willing to take that risk. Maybe it is time that we deploy some, API security as a service tool because we are getting that reward in place. Those conversations that didn't happen in 2024 or prior. And again, as these things start to, more stuff coming out in the news, more focus on APIs and how important and how much they have evolved and how much they've continued to be deployed throughout 2024 and will continue to in 2025. Hopefully that starts generating those conversations as well. Is okay, we're going to do this. It's going to be a risk. How do we stop that 29 seconds? How do we protect ourselves from being able to be exploited for that volume of records? And how can we reduce or completely mitigate that risk? I'd like to see that come in 2025. And I think CISOs should be driving that part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I think, this last point that we had to cover here, I think we've actually talked about it at this point, because Rick, you are in some ways talking exactly about this. Mm-hmm. How do you, as a CISO, is 2025 the year to be more proactive about API security, or to get into a position where you're proactive rather than reactive? And, it's clear the answer to that is yes.
Right? Yeah. I mean, we use automated SIMs now. We use AI-driven SIMs. We've got SOAR, a lot of AI-driven SOAR tools now that can respond way faster than we've ever been able to in the past when it comes to what we are protecting. When we start proactively protecting APIs and realizing and all digesting that 29 seconds, I think that changes the game a bit. But I think once we use the technology that is to start proactively protecting, we can make a dent in this.
Mm-hmm. I had a great member of my staff at several organizations, and he had a background in the Marine Corps. He's Marine, Noah Badome. Shout out to Noah. And he always talks about being left of boom, right? You want to be left of boom, right? Like, and so, you have to get proactive about the places where it's most likely your organization can get hurt, right? That's what Shift Left was all about. I know Shift Left has kind of maybe fallen a little out of favor, but I think APIs are expanding in their usage. They are, as we see, increasing in their exploitation, their use by attackers. And so absolutely, if you haven't been able to be proactive before 2025 is your year to get proactive about API security.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up the conversation a little bit and see if we can take a couple of the questions and answer them. I always like to finish these kinds of conversations with practical advice, because I think we've had a great conversation. It's been really interesting, but ultimately people are going to walk away from this and they're either going to do something or they're going to do nothing. So, we'll start with you, Andrew. Andrew, what would you say for CISOs is the practical next step that they should take, tomorrow, so to speak?
Yeah, it's such a hard question because we're going to have such a broad audience of people at different maturity levels, right? And so I think, what I'd say that the number one thing, right, is know thyself, right? Sit down. And I just said the thing about if you haven't been proactive about API security before, if you haven't been able to be proactive about it, 2025 is your year to be proactive about it. And so that's about understanding what's my organization's level of maturity. Do I know what my APIs are? If you say no, then like API discovery is like should be way up on your list. But if you say, oh yeah, we know where all the APIs are, then maybe it's about, that chart you showed me of the top vulnerability classes, right? In my organizations, it was always a moment of celebration when we finally, drummed out, those injection attacks and those cross-site attacks and whatnot, right? And they would pop up from time to time, one-offs, but you put frameworks in place, you have, things in place that prevent cross-site scripting from happening again, or various XML injection attacks from happening again. And so I think what I would say is the practical step is to take stock of where you are in your organization's security journey, and then, make a commitment to what can I get done in 2025? Can I get API discovery in place in 2025? Can I eliminate XML injection in 2025? And that'll give you a load star.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Rick, what about you? Practical advice?
I would say be humble before you get humbled. I would say incorporate API testing into your pen tests way more than we've been asked to in the past. We do a lot of those, and we really ask people. We remind people this isn't a pissing contest, right? This is not
Yeah.
an us versus you. This is I'm a safe person to break into your stuff. Let me help you. Let whoever you're using, whether it's us or whomever you choose to use for your penetration tests, incorporate that in there. Get your API inventory. If you don't have it, that's a great starting point. We love enumerating APIs. Take that information, use it, be humble, and know that could be a very, very, very likely is a big attack vector, and do something with it before, like I said, before you get humbled.
Yeah.
I'd like to see, again, going back to Andrew's point and probably the point of this whole conversation, know your attack perimeter. And if that's the way you need to find it, then find it, but use it to proactively fix your security, adopt zero trust principles, and align API security into your development process and your innovation processes for your company.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Good. So while we answer questions, I'll put up a couple of slides about wall arm events that are coming up. If you happen to be in the Minneapolis area, we've got an API summit, in-person summit coming up, and you can join us and actually hear from some really great speakers. And we'll also have our next webinar coming up, which will be a deep dive into that API threat stats report, some of the data we shared today. So if you want to get into more of that, we'll have that opportunity as well. So just to get back to the questions, the first one I just want to answer. Someone asked, what if someone is using a platform like Apigee? Apigee, Kong, MuleSoft, these are all API gateways or API management tools, and they're valuable for. Actually, it's interesting because it goes back to that sort of observability versus security observability conversation we're having. They're useful for managing your APIs. They do provide some security capabilities, specifically around providing authentication and authorization, but they generally don't detect and block attacks, and they generally don't produce an API inventory for you. So they know about the APIs you've told them about is kind of the way to think about it. They're also partners of ours. So WallArm and those tools work well together. So next question, is there a framework to measure an API security like an index or something like that? Rick or Andrew, anything out there that you see that's particularly useful for measurement of API security?
I'm not aware of like a global standard. Certainly if you look in things, if you look in, NIST, CSF, or you look in ISO 27001, there are components that you can pull out, but I don't know of
Yeah.
like a credit score for
No.
APIs, right? I would say probably the closest would be kind of some of the material that OWASP puts out, right? And
Yeah.
sort of using that as a maturity sort of benchmark, and in conjunction with a good testing regime.
Yeah.
Rick, do you have thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, you can certainly score individual vulnerabilities with things like CVSS or EPSS, but that's not really a framework or an index, so to speak. It's pretty detailed. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple frameworks. They're not as well known. I mean, Gartner's got the Carta framework. But kind of like what Andrew said, when we do our test cases are really more based around API security from OWASP. Really, all the test cases that really relate more to OWASP,
Yeah.
and I think that's probably an effective one because we start talking about how closely aligned microservices and internal infrastructure is with the APIs as well.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we are at the end of our time here. First of all, I want to thank Rick and Andrew for joining us. I thought it was a really great conversation, super interesting. I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed it as well. So thank you both for participating, and thanks everyone for joining us and spending time with us. As I said, I hope it was interesting and useful for you. That's our goal. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.